Focus on Headline. And let's take a look at what major issues are making the headlines today on Focus on Headline. For this, joining us in the studio, we have our reporters in Handan and Yoon. Guys, welcome back.
Good evening.
Good evening to you guys. We are going to start things off with the top nuclear envoys of South Korea, the U.S., and Japan holding talks over in Indonesia, where they strongly condemned the military cooperation between North Korea and Russia. Since yesterday, we've been talking about the ships from Russia, 2 ships making 5 trips allegedly. They're saying 1,000 containers that could contain potentially hundreds of thousands of artillery that has been reported earlier this week. Nevertheless, Tan, you're going to start us off. Tell us about the remarks made by the top nuclear envoys.
The nuclear envoys met in Jakarta on Tuesday, making one voice over Pyongyang-Moscow military cooperation. U.S. Special Representative for North Korea Sung Kim said that, as you mentioned, North Korea has sent over 1,000 containers of military equipment and munitions to Russia in the past few weeks, which will significantly increase casualties by prolonging Russia's brutal war. He stressed that their military cooperation undermines the global non-proliferation system and threatens stability and security. He added that Washington is deeply concerned about what Russia is providing North Korea in return. South Korea's Special Representative for Korean Peninsula Peace and Security Affairs, Kim Gun, echoed the U.S. envoy's remarks, pointing out that arms cooperation between North Korea and Russia is a blunt violation of the UN Security Council resolutions. Kim said that South Korea will not hesitate in making the North pay for its action. Kim went on to say that North Korea is forcing sacrifices from its people and violating human rights while continuing to obsess over its nuclear development program. He said that North Korea tried hard to strengthen its regime through nuclear development for the past 3 decades, but only ended up with a bleak future facing poverty, instability, and isolation, saying there is no doubt that North Korea has reached out to Russia to find an escape route from its internal and external crises. Kim made clear that it'll only make the reclusive state realize that global determination for non-proliferation is stronger than its nuclear ambition. Hiroyuki Namazu, the new Director General for the Japanese Foreign Ministry's Asian and Oceanian Affairs Bureau, strongly condemned North Korea for disregarding the UNSC resolutions, banning Pyongyang from transferring weapons and related commodities, and accused it of going the opposite direction.
And of course, Kim Gun is not wrong. There is some data that shows that ever since Kim Jong-il had begun focusing more on the military aspect of North Korea, that the poverty rate has skyrocketed, which is why the UNSC earlier this year held a UNSC meeting talking about the human rights of North Korea, which of course North Korea said, why in the world are you guys talking about human rights issues at the UN Security Council? But that, of course, because all the money that could be going to the people of North Korea being spent on weapons development and nuclear development as well. The 3 envoys also discussing the grave human rights situation, speaking of which, in North Korea, focusing on the recent reports on China's forced repatriation of North Korean defectors. Tell us a bit more about that as well.
Right. Concerns have renewed after a news outlet reported that hundreds of North Korean defectors from China's northeastern regions were sent back to their repressive home country against their will last week. I'm sure you've already talked a lot about this. Sung Kim called on China to uphold the international practice of not forcing refugees to return to a country where they are exposed to persecution and allow them to move to a safe third country. Kim Gun said that Seoul has raised the issue with Beijing, and Prime Minister Han Duck-soo said just this afternoon that when he met with President Xi Jinping recently, he raised this issue to the table as well. Julie Turner, new U.S. Special Envoy for North Korean Human Rights rights, who's visiting Seoul this week, vowed to work with Seoul to better address this issue.
I guess in a better situation, if China does agree that they're not going to repatriate any of the North Korean refugees and the defectors, I mean, you would see a huge inflow of North Koreans crossing the border is what it is, which is why, again, North Korea and China being traditional allies, I'm sure kind of breaking this is going to be very difficult, quite unfortunate for the North Korean defectors, as we've heard a number of cases, a number of times on our program, especially on Wednesdays, North Korea now, with things that are done to those that are caught and captured after defecting to North Korea. Moving on here, according to Beyond Parallel, this is a Center for Strategic and International Studies affiliated media outlet. There are signs of continued arms deal between Russia and North Korea. And this, of course, comes after the U.S. government announced that North Korea provided Russia with more than 1,000 containers of military equipment and munitions, with images detailing the transfer routes of the shipment. Haejung, let's talk more about this.
Right. Beyond Parallel's key findings show that the latest satellite imagery of Najin Port in North Korea shows indicators of continued activity related to the transfer of North Korean munitions to Russia, suggesting that at least 6 trips have been made by sea between the two countries since August. And according to the report, the maritime arms shipments between North Korea and Russia are carried out by Russian vessels traveling between the North Korean port of Najin and the Russian port of Dunaj in the country's far east. And the latest satellite images of Najin port from October 13th to October 16th suggests that another trip by a Russian vessel was likely made over the past 4 days. At pier number 3, the northernmost pier at the port, there is a notable increase in the 6-meter shipping containers between October 13th and the 16th. Now, this suggests that another vessel likely unloaded the containers originating from Russia over the weekend. Now, while the images don't reveal what exactly is being unloaded, U.S. National Security Council spokesperson John Kirby said Russia may have shipped its homegrown weapons to North Korea. And on the other hand, at pier number 2, where Russian vessels are believed to have loaded North Korean containers before leaving for Dunaj, approximately 58 6-meter shipping containers observed in the October 13th image were no longer present in the October 16th image. So the decrease in the observed containers suggests these containers were loaded onto a vessel. Now, this all implies that the trade between the two countries is continuing even after the West, including the US and the UK, exposed signs of arms deals between North Korea and Russia by sea. And the ongoing arms transfer activity at Najin Port supplements rail traffic at the Tumangang-Kasan rail crossing between North Korea and Russia. Now, these activities come after weeks of concerns over increased arms cooperation between the two countries. And of course, this is in direct violation of multiple UN Security Council resolutions. Now, with the public exposure detailing these operations, there is a chance that North Korea and Russia will seek to obscure the sea transfer by changing ports or ships or by some other means.
So we can kind of speculate what the Russians are receiving. I mean, what they really need right now is ammunitions. This war in Ukraine, which they did not think was going to last this long, they're running out of ammunitions. And because of sanctions put in place against Russia, they're not able to get any of these ammunitions. They're running out. North Korea happens to be making a whole lot of these. And North Korea happens to be the only country in the world, and one of the few, I should say, that's not abiding by the global community's rules. And so they're getting all this. But the big question now is, what is Russia sending in place? And so there's also speculations that because North Korea is supposed to be launching their third spy satellite, right? And they failed the first 2 times, and they've already, with Kim Jong-un going to the Vostochny Cosmodrome and looking at all the rockets and so forth. There's a speculation that they're going to get some kind of assistance in launching this military spy satellite is what's going on here. But again, no clear-cut information in regards to this. It's I mean, you could have all the satellite imagery all you want, but you can't look through these containers here. Let's move on here. Always frustrating to see this news on an annual basis. crisis. Some 100 Japanese lawmakers visiting the ever so controversial Yasukuni Shrine. This, of course, the symbol of Japan's imperialistic past. You have Prime Minister Fumio Kishida sending offerings, prompting strong criticism from the South Korean government. Tell us more.
Sure, it's that time of the year again when Japanese politicians make a group visit to the Yasukuni Shrine, marking the country's annual autumn festival. They may be paying tribute to the country's war heroes, but for neighboring countries like South Korea, it's a place that symbolizes Japan's imperialistic past and its wartime aggression, a place that honors Class A war criminals. Among the 100 politicians, 96 to be exact, were Japanese lawmakers from all sides of the political aisle, including 3 cabinet members and members of the ruling Liberal Democratic Party, as well as those from all opposition parties. Upon their visit, they said that although the number of people who directly experienced the war, the Second World War here, has decreased considerably, Japan should never allow the memories of the tragic war to fade away. Prime Minister Fumio Kishida, meanwhile, refrained from making a visit, but sent offerings, though it still stirred criticism from neighboring countries. Seoul's foreign ministry expressed deep disappointment and regret that responsible Japanese leaders have sent offerings again, repeatedly paying respects to the Yasukuni Shrine that honors the war criminals and glorifies Japan's past war aggression. It urged Japanese politicians to face history in a responsible and correct manner and show genuine repentance for the past through its action for a future-oriented Seoul-Tokyo relations.
It used to be that, for example, former and late Prime Minister Shinzo Abe, he actually used to go to the Yasukuni Shrine and pay his respects there. And despite the fact that, countries like South Korea and China and so forth, they were very much against this, it was only until I believe the U.S. kind of got involved and they're like, listen, as a leader, you shouldn't really be doing this. There's a lot of controversy surrounding this. And then it was when Abe started sending offerings instead. But it's when they are out of office that they begin going to the Yasukuni Shrine themselves. Abe has done this. Yoshihide Suga has done this as well. And there's highly likely that if and when Fumio Kishida does leave office, that he's probably going to be heading over to Yasukuni Shrine himself. Moving on here, we talked briefly about this yesterday, but it's happened. Chinese President Xi Jinping and Russian President Vladimir Putin held a summit in Beijing this on Wednesday to discuss ways to cooperate on international issues, including the armed conflict between Israel and Hamas. Haejung, tell us how the meeting went for those two.
The meeting between the two leaders was held on the sidelines of the Third Belt and Road Forum. Chinese leader Xi Jinping told Russian President Vladimir Putin that political mutual trust between their countries was continuously deepening and also called for joint efforts by China and Russia to safeguard international fairness and justice. The Chinese leader also noted that he had met with Putin 42 times in the past 10 years and had developed a good working relationship and a deep friendship. Russian President Vladimir Putin touted his country's deep alignment with China as he called Xi a dear friend. He also stressed that close foreign policy cooperation is especially essential in the current difficult conditions. The two leaders' meeting was expected to focus on finding a solution to the Israel-Hamas conflict, and this will be the second meeting between the two leaders this year, the two having met in Moscow in March. And Kremlin spokesperson Dmitry Peskov did mention at a press conference in Beijing that the two leaders are likely to discuss the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, noting that the issue is of great interest to all world leaders. Now, both China and Russia, which have had relatively good relations with the Israelis and the Palestinians, have spoken out differently compared to most Western countries that have been pro-Israel in the latest conflict. China has adopted pro-Palestinian neutrality and criticized Israel's retaliatory airstrikes in Gaza, calling for peace negotiations on a two-state solution that supports the establishment of an independent Palestinian state. Meanwhile, Russia did not take sides with Israel and remains neutral to both sides, focusing on bringing about an immediate ceasefire. Now, earlier, Russia did introduce a resolution to the UN Security Council on the 13th, calling for a humanitarian ceasefire between Israel and the Hamas, but it was voted down 3 days later.
It's kind of ironic that Russia is very much vocal in regards to this, but interesting also that China and the U.S. seems to be kind of on the same page with this whole two-state solution. But again, we mentioned this yesterday. We talked to our expert, Professor Ju, yesterday, and regards to what's going on with China and Russia. But the relationship, it's a weird one because China can't do a whole lot right now with a lot of these sanctions put in place with Russia. They can't help them militarily, knowing that if any kind of military help to Russia is going to result in them getting more sanctions, and considering the fact that China's economy is in shambles right now, they can't afford to do so. And they keep talking about random things, but it really doesn't help each other out whatsoever. But they're still going to keep that traditional ally aspect of things, I'm sure. Let's move on. Speaking of China, the latest on the global chip war. The U.S. having expanded its export curbs to stop China's semiconductor advancement, and the South Korean government says it'll have limited impact on Korean chip makers. Don, let's get the latest details on this.
Sure. South Korea's industry ministry said today, after revising Washington's fresh export controls on chips, that it will have no significant impact on local businesses. The ministry, in a statement, said that the domestic production of cutting-edge AI chips remains small, and chips for consumers are eligible to receive an exemption. It also noted that South Korean firms have already received a verified end-user status from the U.S. government, noting that the semiconductor equipment will not be affected as well. The U.S. last week granted status to Samsung and LG Electronics, allowing them to obtain general authorization to secure items instead of winning licenses. Ministry officials vowed to closely analyze the recent U.S. export control and continue making efforts to minimize its impact on local businesses. It said it'll collaborate closely with the U.S. to ensure the stability of the global chip supply chain and address trade restrictions. The U.S. Department of Commerce on Tuesday outlined new rules regarding expanded export restrictions to prevent China from acquiring advanced chips, closed loopholes, adding a new parameter to slow down China's development in chiplet technology. It removed interconnect bandwidth as a parameter for identifying restricted chips, modified the pre-existing performance threshold, and added a new parameter called performance density threshold aimed at the chiplet technology that China-based chip makers are eager to develop. And it imposed controls on additional types of semiconductor manufacturing equipment, including some DUV lithography systems. It also added 13 China-based companies to the entity list.
Just a quick correction. I believe the mentioning of the Commerce Department issuing last week the rule updating the general authorization was for Samsung Electronics and SK Hynix, I believe, and not LG Electronics.
My apologies.
Moving on here, we are going to continue now and talk about the armed conflict over in the Middle East, and this is certainly what we've been very worried about, that something like this would happen. There was a massive blast at a hospital in central Gaza on Tuesday local time, killing hundreds of patients and civilians. This would make it the deadliest incident in Gaza since Israel launched its offensives on the Gaza Strip in response to the October 7th attack by the Hamas. Haejun, quite concerning here. Let's get the latest on that.
Right. This destructive blast hit the Al-Ali Arabi Baptist Hospital in the center of Gaza City on Tuesday. According to a Palestinian Health Ministry official, at least 500 people were killed in the blast. But local health authorities say that the death toll is expected to rise from the current 500, as hundreds are severely injured and hundreds are still under the rubble of the collapsed building. And Dawn will have more on this, but in terms of who was responsible for this bombing, the Hamas, Israeli Defense Forces, and the Islamic Jihad are pointing fingers at each other, basically all groups denying the accusations pinned on them. And due to this fatal explosion, ambulances and private cars rushed some 350 casualties from the Al-Ali blast to Gaza City's main hospital, Al-Shifa, which was already overwhelmed with wounded people from other strikes, and hundreds of patients and civilians were seeking shelter at the hospital. A video footage that the Associated Press confirmed was from the hospital showed fire engulfing the building and the hospital grounds strewn with torn bodies, many of them young children. The grass around them was strewn with blankets, school backpacks, and other belongings. And this incident casted a cloud over U.S. President Biden's trip as well. President Biden, who left for Tel Aviv on Tuesday night, just arrived in Israel just about an hour ago. He had also planned to meet with Arab leaders in Jordan after this visit to show support of the U.S. ally in the ongoing conflict with the Hamas, but his trip to Jordan was called off the last minute. According to the White House, after consulting with King Abdullah II of Jordan, and in light of the days of mourning announced by President Abbas of the Palestinian Authority, President Biden decided to postpone his travel to Jordan, sending his deepest condolences of the victims of the hospital bombing. And the news of the recent hospital explosion also prompted a flurry of condemnation from Islamic countries, including Saudi Arabia, Egypt, Syria, Libya, Iraq, and Iran. And Amman in Jordan, where President Biden was originally scheduled to visit Arab leaders, angry protesters attempted to storm the Israeli embassy. The World Health Organization also condemned the horrific attack, calling for the immediate protection of civilians and healthcare.
So earlier this week, we talked about a potential 5-hour ceasefire that was apparently brokered by Egypt and the United States, and Israel had apparently agreed to this, and the Egyptian security forces had basically said, listen, Israel agreed to this from the southern Gaza to the Rafah route. They're allowing the residents of Gaza to leave the area and cross over to the Egypt was what's being said. And I believe the report that's coming out right now is that at the time, and I said this early on Monday, I believe, that Israel came out later saying that they did not agree with this. There's also reports of many Palestinians in Gaza being told by Israeli forces to leave the area, evacuate. There's going to be a ceasefire, move on, and shortly after leaving, basically bombarded in an air attack. And so, Polina, you're asking who's right and who's wrong in this. There is no right in a conflict like this. There's only wrong. And of course, there's a whole lot of back and forth in regards to this and people taking sides. But I think we can all agree that the blast that killed hundreds in the Gaza hospital, they're all innocent people there. Hamas, Israel, they're continuing to trade blame as rage spreads in the region and the international community as well. Tom, let's get more on this horrific incident at the hospital.
Right. Hamas called the hospital blast a horrific massacre, saying it was caused by an Israeli strike. Palestinian United Nations Ambassador Riyad Mansour, standing with Arab UN envoys, told the United Nations that Palestine condemn this act in the strongest possible terms and it hold Israel responsible for this massacre, this crime, stressing that those responsible for this crime should face justice. But the Israeli military blamed Islamic Jihad, a smaller, more radical Palestinian militant group that often works with Hamas. It said Islamic Jihad militants had fired a barrage of rockets near the hospital and that intelligence from multiple sources indicated the group was responsible. In a briefing with reporters, the Chief Army spokesman, Admiral Daniel Hagari, said the Army determined there were no Air Force, ground, or naval attacks in the area at the time of the blast. He said radar detected outgoing rocket fire at the same moment and intercepted communications between militant groups, indicating that Islamic Jihad fired the rockets. Hagari also shared aerial footage collected by a military drone that showed a blast that he said was inconsistent with Israeli weaponry. Meanwhile, amid worsening humanitarian crisis in the Gaza Strip, the Israel Defense Forces announced the creation of a humanitarian zone in southern Gaza where international aid will be provided. The announcement came after days of negotiations with Egypt, the U.S., and others to create a safe zone for fleeing Gazans. The IDF says Palestinians should go to the humanitarian zone set in the Al-Mawasi area, close to Khan Younis, where international humanitarian aid will be provided as needed. It also renewed its calls on Palestinians in the northern part of the Gaza Strip to evacuate to the south, as the military has warned it'll soon heavily target the area. Hopes are high that the zone will serve as a lifeline to save innocent Gazans in the region that has been cut off from water, electricity, and fuel supplies for nearly 2 weeks, completely blockaded by Israel.
I know there's been a lot of footages surfacing on the internet these days, and a lot of people pointing at certain videos are being propaganda, and other side being a propaganda for the Israel side, one being propaganda videos for the Hamas and so forth. And so this is exactly what Israel is saying. They're basically saying that the Palestinian, Islamic Jihad had basically done the blast themselves, and they try to make it look like Israel looks bad, whereas the Hamas and the PIJ are basically like, we're not crazy enough to be able to, attack our own people, especially a hospital. And so even with this, there's a lot of people pointing fingers right now. This is a propaganda. I do really encourage you guys, our listeners out there, to kind of be careful to make judgments based on some of these footages that are coming out, because there are footages and articles that do seem very much one-sided at this time. And I think we should kind of look at the bigger picture. And the bigger picture right now is there are just way too many victims of this armed conflict. We'll continue to keep a close tab on this and move on this time. Come back to South Korea, where President Yoon Suk-yeol called for a reorganization of the police, this centering on public security and reinforced response capability at the scene of crime. He also emphasized preventing crimes against the vulnerable members of the society, pledging full support of bolstering policing capabilities as well. Hajun, let's get more on this.
Right. Today, at a ceremony marking the 78th National Police Day, President Yoon said heinous crimes should be eradicated so that people can live without anxiety. He emphasized the importance of public safety, saying that crimes targeting the vulnerable members of our community, such as sexual assault, child abuse, domestic violence, and stalking, should not be tolerated. The South Korean leader also stressed that police enforcement needs to go to beyond apprehending criminals and needs to prevent crimes from occurring in the first place, and that the police needs to work together with relevant organizations to detect risks at an early stage and build a dense social safety net to protect victims against repeated crime. The president also pledged necessary support to improve police officers' work environment so that they can actively respond to violent crimes, including by swiftly distributing less lethal handguns and new equipment such as knife-proof body armor. He also renewed his commitment to creating a culture where men and women in uniform are given the respect they deserve, saying his administration has worked to quickly address the police's long-held wishes, such as a raise in the base salary. And on a related note, in September, the Korea National Police Agency announced an organizational restructuring plan to strengthening policing capabilities. Now, this plan included the goal of securing a minimum of 9,000 additional officers patrolling the streets to prevent heinous crimes. These patrol units will be responsible for public safety, particularly in areas vulnerable to crime, such as crowded places and parks. And the police agency is currently developing a detailed plan for implementation.
Guys, let's move on. This has kind of been overshadowed by a lot of bigger news, but this is a big one because the government has been trying to push for an increase in the quota of medical students. They're actually set to announce the detail of its plans to expand the medical school enrollment quota tomorrow. But this has been met with vehement opposition from the medical associations, but nevertheless, the government is unlikely to unveil a fixed number. There's been numbers being tossed around left and right here, but Don, let's get more on this.
Sure. The Yoon administration has rolled up its sleeves from last year to expand the enrollment quota at medical schools, saying such a change is necessary to improve medical services and also to prepare for the country's aging population. The public also appears to be welcoming the news as major large-scale hospitals across Korea, mostly centered in Seoul, are always overflowing with patients. And the general consensus is that it's about time that we foster more doctors, as the enrollment quota has been fixed at a total of 3,058 for the past 17 years. Advocates say an increase is necessary to address physician shortages in provincial areas in particular, and less preferred specialties as well, such as pediatrics, and better prepare for a future increase in healthcare demand from the country's aging population. In 2021, South Korea had 2.6 physicians per 1,000 people, which is significantly lower than the average of 3.7 of the OECD members. And the figure is much lower in rural regions. And a recent study by the Korea Institute for Health and Social Affairs predicted that at this pace, Korea will face a shortage of more than 27,000 doctors by 2035. Doctors, on the other hand, have expressed strong opposition, arguing a quota increase will contribute little to solving the problem without a fundamental change to South Korea's medical system. Doctors' associations are warning of large-scale protests and collective action, claiming that the government should focus instead on measures to more effectively allocate physicians to deficient fields and increase compensation rather than simply increasing the number of medical students. They argue that expanding the number of placements for medical schools could adversely affect the quality of education and training. And ironically, they also argue that a quota increase is unnecessary due to the declining population and easy access to medical care. They're also lashing out at the government for not having sufficient discussions on the matter before making an announcement. Now, under such circumstances, it remains murky if the government will be able to fix on specific details or a specific number in tomorrow's announcement. But it has been widely expected that it will increase the quota at least by 500, especially at medical schools outside of the capital region. The government has previously said that if it finalizes the expansion of the quota, it'll take effect from 2025.
Yeah, so the numbers that were being tossed up, originally I think it was like something like 1,000, and it went as high as 3,000. Now, both sides have very good arguments. Now, the medical association's argument, I think the first argument is if it makes it too easy for people to become medical students, and if it makes it too easier for people to become doctors, it's not good for the patients, right? You want people who kind of graduated from the most competitive medical schools and
the top-notch
schools and so forth. At the same time, others are arguing, well, the medical associations are arguing against it because they just don't want to lose their jobs. But I believe Health Minister Cho Gyu-hong came out recently saying, like, listen, we are in shortage of doctors right now. And then others people are saying, well, I mean, if you look at why there's a shortage, not necessarily because there's a shortage of doctors, but there's a lot of people who want to do I don't want to call it easy, but the less, I guess, intensive side of what doctors can do, and this is the plastic surgery, right? The cosmetic sides of things. A lot of people have been shifting from towards the cosmetics because you can, work 9 to 6 and make a whole lot of money, and there's always a need for cosmetic surgeries, I guess, and which is why with the declining child population and birth rate, there has been less pediatrics doctors as well. There's so many arguments right now. They're also saying increasing the number of doctors doesn't necessarily mean that some of these smaller provinces, the other areas, are going to be filled with doctors, because eventually the doctors are going to move up to the capital Seoul and the Gyeonggi region and so forth. But it's a tough one, and the Medical Association, the Korean Medical Association, amongst other associations, have come out saying that they are going to come out very, very strongly with this, and they could potentially see a collective action from the doctors there. Also, unionized workers of Seoul Metro, this is the operator of the subway service here in Seoul, they plan to stage a strike next month. This to protest against the firm's workforce reduction plan. Haejung, let's get the details of this.
Sure, the walkout set for November 9th will be hard to avoid unless Seoul Metro suspends its downsizing plan. The union is resisting Seoul Metro's ongoing plan to reduce its workforce by 13.5%, or 2,211 employees by 2026, to help reduce the company's widening deficit. The walkout plan was announced Wednesday morning as a majority of Seoul Metro's unionized workers have thrown their support behind the strike in a vote carried out from last Thursday through this Monday. Over 73% have voted to stage a walkout. The union claims a drastic cut in the workforce could lead to safety issues, demanding the withdrawal of the downsizing plan. According to a union official, a workforce reduction and a restructuring plan would inevitably pose a threat to the safety of citizens, as well as workers, and weigh down on the quality of public services. The union said it will be forced to go ahead with the walkout if Seoul Metro does not withdraw the restructuring plan or opts not to hire the necessary minimum safety workforce for this year. And if the strike materializes, it will be the second consecutive year of strikes after last year. But Seoul Metro, which has been suffering from large-scale deficits, say it is inevitable to reduce its workforce to normalize its business. The joint negotiation team, comprised of the Korean Confederation of Trade Unions and the Federation of Korean Trade Unions, held a final mediation meeting with the company the previous day, but they failed to reach an agreement. Now, Seoul Metro is in charge of running subway lines numbers 1 through 8 in Seoul, but even if the walkout is staged as planned, weekday subway services will be maintained between 50 to 80% of the normal level in order to minimize any public inconvenience, according to union officials.
Yeah, I mean, we've, again, had these collective action from Seoul Metro before, but they've done a fantastic job in making sure, especially during the rush hours in the morning and the evening, that it doesn't impact the passengers. So, again, another thing that we'll keep a close tab on. Guys, thank you very much for your reports. Have a safe one, and we'll see you guys again.
Thank you.
You can listen to Korea Now with me, SJ Lee, by downloading the Arirang radio application, or tune in online by visiting www.arirangradio.com. So make sure you tune in Mondays through Fridays, 6 p.m. to 8 p.m. Korea time.